Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one there are several developments all across the front line. Significant developments in terms of how many there are. The Russians have made several advances to the east and to the west of Pokrovsk, also in the direction of the city itself. The Russians made some advances in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, while the Ukrainians launched counterattacks to the north of those positions, to the north of Donetsk and in the Luhansk region. The Russians also reached the Dnipropetrovsk border area to the southwest of Pokrovsk and to the west of Vuhledar. Starting out in the southern section of the front line, the Russians managed to gain control over half of Zelenopole, started fighting over the fortified positions to the east of the town, and gaining control over the first street in Novopil. The Russians are storming both towns simultaneously from along the road to the north and combined with an assault from the south. With the isolation of Novopil from Zelenopole, the Ukrainians only have one direction to flee to, and that is across the border area into the Zaporizhia region in the direction of Dnipropetrovsk and the fortified positions to the south of it. This means that the Ukrainians would be exposed, withdrawing from Novopil towards Dnipropetrovsk, as it is a far distance with no fortifications, no settlements, and so on, completely open fields with a few forest lines. Any Ukrainian withdrawal from that would be exposed to Russian artillery fire and FPV and drone strikes. Zelenopole has fortified positions right near it. That means that they have locations to withdraw to. However, an assault by the Russians in the western direction towards the border area could cut off and isolate these fortified positions from the west. The Russians would have the option to attack from the northern flank to flank the fortified positions from the rear, or to attack from the southern flank to isolate the fortified positions from Dnipropetrovsk, or a combined attack from both sides once they capture the towns of Zelenopole and Novopil, opening up the road towards the Zaporizhia region. At the same time, the Russians also managed to gain control over the forest lines west of Zelenopole, as well as the river line to the north and the fortified position in the area. This has opened up the road for Shevchenko from the southern direction near Zelenopole. The Russians continued offensive operations both in the western direction towards as well as the rear of the fortified positions, opening up the road in those directions, at the same time in the northern direction towards Shevchenko from the south. The Ukrainians in turn launched a counterattack in the direction of Vuhledar. This is to strike the Russian supply lines towards the offensive operations in the direction of Shevchenko, limiting the supplies the Russians have available for future attacks on the town. As we can see, the Russians have two direct assaults towards it from the south and from the east. This would cut off the eastern flank. The Ukrainians managed to regain control over some forest lines as they close in on the town. However, the battle over the town is ongoing. The Ukrainians have yet to capture it or cut off the supply line. To the west of Korohova, the Russians managed to gain control over additional forest lines connecting Bogdanivka to Andrivka in the south. Russians continued offensive operations here in the forest lines and fields to gain control over the northern flank of the fortified positions from Oleksivka to Dashne. At the same time, they managed to reach the border area here northwest of Vuhledar, where this picture here shows the 90th Tank Division, a small unit of them, at the border with the barbed wire lines that are marking the border area. And from this, we can see that the Russians have bypassed Vuhledar, and this is likely one of the areas from which DRGs are crossing into the Dnipropetrovsk region. The Russians also managed to advance to the north in the direction of Novomykolaiivka, gaining a foothold in the eastern parts of the town. And as we can see, they've also reached the border area here to the north of Novomykolaiivka. So with this, we see that the Russians have reached the border area towards the Dnipropetrovsk region in two areas from which they can send DRGs across. In the direction of Novomykolaiivka, it is the Solona River, and there's the fortified positions of the Ukrainians. There's not a lot of forest areas. This means that the area where DRGs are crossing into the Dnipropetrovsk region is solely the area here north of Vuhledar from the Kudlyarivka and Troitske directions. With the foothold within Novomykolaiivka, the battle over the final positions of the Ukrainians here near the border area southwest of Pokrovsk are taking place. The Russians are fighting over Vuhledar to the south, Novomykolaiivka and Moravka to the north. Getting control over this entire section will allow them to start fighting towards Novopavlivka, threatening the supply lines and the Ukrainian supply hub in the area, both with offensive operations to the south and beyond Dnipropetrovsk if they start fighting over the town, and establish it as their own supply hub for future offensive operations across the border area. The Russians also managed to advance south of Pokrovsk, getting control over the first line here east of Peshane, attacking the direction of the railway area here to the north. The Russians are attempting to open up the road here south of Svirove, getting control over the waste heap and the railway area, as well as the fortified positions in the area, allowing for additional supply lines into Leonotovichi, where they're looking to gain control over that town as well and enter into Pokrovsk itself. At the same time, the Russians have also attacked the railway area here to the east, where they're looking to gain control over several fortified positions, forest lines, and opening up the road towards Pokrovsk from the south, which will open up for offensive operations by the Russians entering into Pokrovsk from the south and southwest. Moving on to the east of Pokrovsk, the Russians managed to gain control over the remaining parts of Yelisavetivka, as well as the fortified positions just outside the town, opening up the road for future offensive operations towards the defensive line of the Ukrainians just southwest of Melnivka and northwest of Yelisavetivka. With their fortified positions and the town controlled by the Russian forces, they'll be able to launch offensive operations from Mirolyubivka, Yelisavetivka, and Melinivka to attack the fortified positions from three separate directions, directly head-on from the northern and southern flanks, as well as from the rear. The Russians would look to gain control over Merinid to secure the northern flank further. However, offensive operations towards these fortified positions can already start, where the Russians can attack all of these areas simultaneously from multiple logistical hubs such as Mirolyubivka, Yelisavetivka, and Melinivka. The Russians also managed to secure the northern flank of Melinivka, gaining control over the small storage area to the north of the town, advancing along the forest lines and the fortified positions to gain control over the area here south of Shevchenko-Pershi. The Russians also managed to advance north of Nova Poltavka in the direction of Popiv Yar and Poltavka, gaining control over the fortified positions to the south of Poltavka while fighting over the ones south of Popiv Yar. The Russians have reached the outskirts of both settlements and will start storming them soon, which will open up the road to Rusin Yar, gaining control over which will create a buffer zone between the Russian and Ukrainian forces between the TO-504 highway and the next defensive line of the Ukrainians. Also allow the Russians to flank Shevchenko, Pershi, and Kopcheve from the rear, and at the same time opening up the road for the next defensive position of the Ukrainians, which is the three settlements of Roshkishne, Dovabelka, and Stepanivka. The Russians also advance here northeast of Novolenivka, where they managed to gain control over additional forest lines and start attacking next forest lines on the southern bank of the river line, reaching the outskirts of Yablunivka from the western direction. The Russians are looking to advance along the fortified position on the western bank of the river line and the settlement itself from the eastern bank of the river line, while advancing along the forest lines here to the south of Yablunivka to cut off the road connection between Yablunivka and the settlements of the Ukrainians here to the south, such as Soria, Staramykolaivka, and so on. The Russians also managed to advance northeast of Romanivka, advancing along the forest lines in this direction as well, as they continue offensive operations towards Novospassky, Shcherbinivka, and Katerinivka from the western direction. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians launched a counterattack to the north of Donetsk, where they have managed to regain several positions. These offensive operations took place continuously since the original recapture, which took place 6 days ago, which indicates that this has been ongoing for the past week. The Ukrainians here managed to regain control over some forest lines and fortified positions north of Druzhba. They are looking to regain control over areas here north of Donetsk to cut off the supply line for the Russian forces fighting near Dashne and Diliivka. However, the Russians have secured the railway area over the past few days, which has allowed them to continue their offensive operations towards Diliivka and the north of Krymsk to secure their positions here to the north of the city and to bypass the negative effects of the Ukrainians attacking Druzhba. However, the Ukrainians can still regain a foothold within Druzhba, and if they are able to cut off the railway connection, then the supplies reaching Diliivka and the front line would be limited for the Russian forces and can become under Ukrainian fire control with FPV drones and artillery striking those positions. Moving further north to the Luhansk region, the Ukrainians managed to regain control over a forest patch here west of Serhivka, where the Ukrainians are looking to strike the bridgehead across the Dnipropetrovsk river line near Raihorodka. They're looking to regain control over Nadia and Serhivka before pushing further down southwards to the flank of Novaya Horivka and Tvertlikhobovo. The Ukrainians are here looking to strike further the core of the Russian positions across the Serbets River line, while the Russians attack the flanks to counteract these offensive operations by the Ukrainians. Despite significant Russian advances across the front line and the Russians reaching the Dnipropetrovsk region, the Ukrainians continued their own counterattacks. They also continued their attempts to enter into Russian territory in the Belgorod and Kursk regions. The net gains of the Russian forces over the past 24 hours were 18 square kilometers. This is due to the fact that the Ukrainians managed to recapture approximately 7 square kilometers, putting it down from 25 to 18. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.